Thank you very much. So maybe that one will be easier. Does my clicker work? There. I want to start by saying that what you guys are doing already is amazing. I have been working in the leadership space in the academic leadership space for over a decade, and I worked in management consulting before that, doing leadership development in sort of corporate and industrial contexts. And leadership is really, really hard. And what you guys are doing, practicing leadership among people doing super important work that's often complex and difficult, and they're showing up to do it for no pay, what you do is especially difficult and especially important. And having worked in the leadership space for a while, I say with the utmost confidence that the best leadership I see is in a volunteering context, because there is such a true and genuine focus on the people, on the relationships, on the purpose alignment, the mission, the values, and it is beautiful. So we're talking about leadership today, and we're going to talk about some leadership practices and some of our research that has come out more recently on what we know about the distinctiveness of leading in volunteering contexts. But I wanted to start with that really important point that you're already doing an amazing job. Hopefully, what we outlined for you today gives you some new things to try, perhaps, some new insights, but you're already doing awesome, and I wanted to make that very clear before we get into it. So, gotta punch it. Okay, I've been introduced. I didn't know if I was getting introduced, so I won't do it again. Toby, Tram, we're from UTAS. At UTAS, we have a volunteer leadership research group. And the reason we have that research group is because having worked in the leadership space for some time, I became aware of the fact that while there is a huge leadership industry, there is almost no research on leading within volunteering contexts. So in 2019, we started our volunteering leadership research group at UTAS, and since then we have worked with a number of peak bodies, including Volunteering Queensland, have a very long-standing and meaningful relationship with Volunteering Tasmania, was pretty involved with Volunteering Australia through the drafting of the national strategy, and then that implementation phase. We have done lots of industry reports, partnered research, and a lot of it's also published sort of in academic outlets. Happy to share. Most of this is open access, so you can find it if you really like reading research insights. I'm also happy to share stuff, and we have contact details at the end that I will share with you. Just to sort of preface what we're going to be focused on today, and that is retaining volunteers. We've heard a few times today that volunteer numbers are dropping in most cases across the sector. Some subsectors, some organizations are not seeing a drop in volunteering, but sort of across the board, there's a general consensus that numbers are dropping. And what we're focused on in our work on leading volunteers is really retention. Because attracting and recruiting volunteers, that's super important. But when it comes to leadership, often we have an opportunity to use our leadership to most effect when we already have volunteers that we are interacting with. So that is our focus, is on how we can practice and develop our leadership to help keep our volunteers volunteering. So what we're going to do over the next, it was going to be about 30 minutes. We're trying to condense it down because we're already past the time that we were supposed to start talking. So we'll try to bring it in for you. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a bit of a look at what leadership is. This is a deceptively simple question, and there are lots of versions to it. I just want to start with a few moments on that so that as we get into the content of our research, we're all sort of loosely on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we are talking about leading and managing volunteers. Then I'm going to pass over to Tram. Tram's going to outline some of the general links between leadership and volunteering. A lot of that we have already sort of loosely and very precisely talked about today. And then Tram's going to outline sort of a fairly substantial chunk of her PhD research to date, which is 8 evidence-based practices for helping you retain your volunteers. So this has to do with all the research that's been done. She's packaged it up into 8 tidy little strategies for you. So she'll talk you through them. Before we then get a little bit more specific, context is everything, and in leadership that is true, and leading volunteers that is true, and while leading within a volunteering context is sort of specific, there's a ton of diversity even within the volunteering ecosystem. So we'll do a bit of a deeper dive on a specific piece of research another one of our colleagues has led on leading emergency service response, and I've seen some uniforms here today. So hopefully what we share from that work resonates with those of you who are working in emergency response volunteering. Then we were going to allow some time for you guys to do a little bit of reflection and action planning for your own practice of leadership and leading your volunteers, but we'll see. That might get gobbled up to sort of recoup some time in the program. So that's what we're going to do over the next 30-ish minutes. And as promised, first up, what is leadership? Now, I've been working on and with leadership for a while, and especially in my teaching, my students very rarely get a precise definition of leadership. And one of the main reasons for that is that leadership is so contextual that it's going to look so different in different contexts that if we try to use a precise definition, it's just not going to apply when we look somewhere else or somewhere else. So instead of giving a precise definition, I talk in slightly more general terms about what leadership involves, and I'll get to that in just one moment. But first, a couple of key points. I think there is a very prevailing, and hopefully less so in this room, but a very sort of prevalent assumption that when we talk about leaders and leadership, we're talking about the boss, who the boss is and what the boss does. And ideally, and in a lot of cases, we have someone who is the boss, so they are in a management position, they have legitimate authority, they can hire, fire, promote, invest resources or not in people. Often, they also demonstrate leadership, and that's fantastic. That's what we want. But just being the boss or having that position does not necessarily mean we practice leadership, and definitely doesn't mean we have to practice leadership all the time, right? There's other things we have to do when we're the boss. So I just want to make that distinction because, well, hopefully less so in this room again, but most of us working in other sectors have experienced working for bosses who definitely do not demonstrate leadership, especially good leadership, okay? So I just want to sort of tease apart leading and leadership from a position of formal authority, a management position, being the boss. The flip side of this is that we don't need a position in order to lead. So as we're talking about leadership practices over the next 20 minutes or so, I don't want you to think, well, I'm not the boss, so this doesn't apply to me. Because leadership is a practice. It is a process that occurs between people, and we do not need to be the boss. We do not need to have a formal position in order to practice leadership. And so my sort of provocation is that you are all leaders. Hopefully you already identify as a leader. If not, I encourage you, I insist that you are a leader because you do practice leadership. And the way that we understand leadership, again, you know, researchers are weird and we don't agree on a ton, but there is sort of emerging consensus that when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about sort of relational processes between people that occur when we start working together towards shared goals. And again, I try to steer clear from very precise definitions, but I will offer you sort of these key elements of leadership. And when I offer these elements of leadership, what I'm, again, reminding you of is that this is not just what the boss does, this is what is happening when leadership is happening. And ideally, the boss is involved, but not always and not necessarily. And so the first key element is relationships. And I know loosely who I'm talking to, and I know relationships is really front and center when it comes to managing volunteers. That is brilliant, that is beautiful. When it comes to leadership, the reason relationships are the sort of most fundamental element is because it's through relationships that influence flows and influence is exchanged. Now, influence it's how we affect other people. It's how we affect what someone else is thinking, feeling, or doing. There are lots of ways to affect what people are thinking, feeling, and doing. We can command, and sometimes, some situations, again, emergency response, we need command, and that is totally appropriate. There are other ways which are not ideal, and I would maybe argue that there's never a time for things like coercion, manipulation, and other ways of getting people to do things. And what really makes leadership distinct is that it's influence that is getting people to do things, that is affecting how people are thinking, what they're feeling, and what they're doing. Now, what makes influence distinct is that it is given. We do not take influence, we give it. We choose, sometimes implicitly, but we choose who we are influenced by. So when leadership is occurring, one person is not forcing other people to do stuff or to take on board what they're saying. The other people are actively choosing to be influenced by, or sometimes a little more passively choosing. But there's an active giving of influence, okay? It's not taken. And that's a really important distinction of leadership from a lot of these other processes of getting people to do things. The other two sort of key elements, absolutely key elements of leadership, are these ideas of shared purpose and collective effort. And again, you kind of know this. Shared purpose is what we're all doing here together. And when you have volunteers showing up, chances are, probably, hopefully, they have a pretty clear sense of why, what it is you're striving towards together. And then collective effort is sort of that, almost sometimes it feels a little bit magical synergy that happens when you start achieving more together than you can working in isolation. So these are the key elements of leadership. If you are seeing or experiencing these things, chances are leadership is happening. If you are not seeing or experiencing these things, chances are something else is happening, which often is fine, but these really do distinguish leadership. Now, no. Okay, so I just want to go back to this, not the position. And again, that's an invitation when Tram, and she's about to jump in now and outline these 8 practices that have been shown to be effective in leading volunteers because they help volunteers want to come back. It's not about position. That's about anyone that has the opportunity to interact with volunteers when they're volunteering, because we all do lead when we do these things, when we have relationships, exchange influence, identify, pursue shared purpose, and nurture collective effort. So these practices apply to all of us. But leadership is not one size fits all, so the practice is going to look different for each of you when you implement it in your unique volunteering context. So I'm going to leave it there. I will rejoin you once Tram has outlined these 8 practices for you. It's hard to push.
Yes. Thank you, Toby. Hi, everyone. My name is Tram. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. I'm doing a PhD research focusing on investigating and developing volunteer leadership. So in the next around 15 minutes, I will go with you through 2 parts. The first one is what does leadership do with volunteering? And the second part will be some effective, practical leadership strategies to keep volunteering. And these are the summary from my 13,000 word review. So my apologize that I have a long note and sometimes I almost read from this. Yeah. Okay, so as Toby mentioned earlier, all of us have the potential to be leaders, even though you realize it or not. And then, in a lot of instances, volunteering develops leadership capabilities. So there is evidence suggested that team-based corporate volunteering days are better at developing teamwork or leadership, more than something like having fancy consultant in and deliver workshop. But of more relevance to the vitality of volunteering is the fact that leadership is crucial to sustaining the volunteer workforces. So leadership is just not about making decisions or setting goals, it's about the connection. Leadership is the relationship that volunteers have with their formal or informal leaders. Leadership directly influences how or if a volunteer feels about their volunteering experience. It also shapes entire volunteering experience. So when you have good leadership, volunteers feel supported, valued, and heard. So it's more likely that they stay engaged, committed, and continue volunteering for your organization. But when leadership is lacking, volunteers may feel unsupported, unappreciated, disconnected, so it's easy for them to walk away. So this brings us to the important questions. What is effective volunteer leadership? So by researching, we have found, that volunteer leadership is deemed effective if it continues to work to keep volunteers satisfied, committed, enough to continue volunteering and contributing to the organizational values. So, some scholars from my research they suggest that we apply conventional approaches to leading or managing volunteers. However, leadership in the paid context for paid employee might not appropriate for volunteers who work in the unpaid context. So there are several leadership styles have been suggested, such as transformational leadership, servant leadership, autonomy supportive leadership. However, volunteer and paid employees, they have different motivation, commitment, and also preferences. So volunteer, they don't have formal obligation like employees. They are also not bound by salary or contracts. So this means that volunteers' commitment is not fueled by something monetary incentives, but they are fueled by personal fulfillment, values, passion. So this makes it's important for us to understand that what is effective volunteer leadership within the volunteering context. So we did a systematic literature review. So we researched all the empirical studies on leading volunteer in the top quality leadership, management, and voluntary journals to find any of the practice that deemed to be effective in leading volunteers. So it helped us to come up with the answer that effective volunteer leadership facilitates volunteer satisfaction, engagement, commitment, and retention or turnover intention. So volunteer satisfaction, this means how content or fulfilled volunteers feel about their volunteering experience. Engagement is how dedicated, absorbed, vigorous volunteer is when completing their volunteering. Commitment is volunteers' emotional attachment to their organization, their loyalty, or their willingness to remain with the organization. And retention or turnover intention, it is how likely a volunteer is to quit or to continue volunteering. So we keep this in mind that effective volunteer leadership that facilitate volunteer satisfaction, engagement, commitment, and retention. And before we move to the next part, that having summed up the practical strategy for effective volunteer leadership, I would like to ask you all to take a moment to reflect on your own experience. So, in your own volunteer context and experience, what are the effective leadership practices that you have experienced that stood out to you as good, as effective, as positive? And within this, we will use Slido to answer. Here, we use the word practice for leadership because we believe that it should be action, not something just theories or ideas. So, anything that you do, you actually do, something that you apply, that you refine, repeat it over time. So we will have around 2 to 3 minutes for this because we are running out of time. So I hope you all have shared your positive, effective volunteer leadership practice in your mind. Okay, we will go back later. I think that behind each of the practice that you have shared, there must be really meaningful stories, and I hope that we could have enough time to hear that. But because we don't, so I suggested that we keep it in mind first, and now we shift our perspective to another perspective to hear what research tells us all about effective volunteer leadership practice. So we keep in mind previously strongly that effective volunteer leadership facilitates, sorry, you got that in your handout. Yes, so effective volunteer leadership facilitates volunteer satisfaction, engagement, commitment, and retention. And we keep it in mind so that we carefully examine any of the studies from the review to look for any leadership practice that determined to be effective in sustaining and retaining volunteer. And then we come up with these 8 practices. So now I will shortly explain you what each practice means and also give you some suggested action how to implement these practices. For the first practice is enabling meaningful relationship. So this practice means leaders provide volunteers with opportunity to build and maintain to build rapport and maintain their useful, authentic social connection with others. When volunteers usually thrive when they feel connected with their leaders, peers, and people in their community. Good relationship characterized on trust, loyalty, mutual understanding also important because it makes volunteers more satisfied. So to foster and enable more meaningful relationship, as a leaders, you can provide volunteers with more opportunity to join social, professional events, to join social groups, to get to know people that can offer valuable resources or knowledge to volunteers. It's also important that leaders encourage volunteers to build strong network within and outside the organization. So for the second practice, this is facilitating personal development. So this practice means leaders care and concerned for volunteer advancement so that they create conditions for volunteer growth both personally and professionally. Offering development opportunities can help volunteers more confident and fulfilled, which can help them more satisfied, committed with the organization. So as a leader, you can provide volunteers with a lot of chances, such as promotion, taking on more responsibility, challenging projects, or something like secondment, so that they can broaden their experience, knowledge, and appetite. The third practice, it will be fostering a sense of identity. So with this practice, you make your volunteer feel inclusive and then connect volunteers with the impact of their work. Help volunteers see how their efforts align with the organizational mission and values. This is really important because when you clearly explain volunteers about the impact of their work, it helps volunteers feel more satisfied and also infuse a sense of engagement and connection with their organization. And leaders can also foster a sense of identity. For example, you clearly explain, regularly communicate organizational mission and values so that you make your volunteers feel more connected with these. It's also important that leaders create a sense of cohesion within the organization so that volunteers feel they are part of a unified team, a group, or something bigger. So the next practice, the fourth one will be promoting effective communication. This means leaders encourage two-way communication, prioritize active listening, and also create an environment where volunteers can share and hear from different perspectives. So effective communication is important for volunteer engagement, satisfaction, retention. It is because when volunteers can feel comfortably to share and also talk with leaders about their feelings, opinion. It makes them feel more connected, satisfied, and motivated to engage with the organization. So, to promote effective communication, as a leader, you should make an effort to communicate regularly with volunteers. It's also important to keep them in the loop about any organizational issues. The next practice will be granting autonomy. So this means that leaders provide volunteers a level of freedom so that they can make decisions or they have more control over their volunteering. When volunteers can flexibly adjust and align their volunteering with personal goals or expectations, it tends that they are more accountable, motivated, and satisfied, and they are also more connected with the organizational goals. So to foster a sense of identity, leaders might encourage volunteers to take more responsibility for how they shape their volunteering or how they approach their task. And it's also important that when you make any decision, you should ask for volunteer input, suggestion, and if possible, just incorporate them into the plans. The sixth practice will be enhancing organizational support. So this means that you provide volunteers with a secure and supportive environment and ensure that volunteers have access to necessary resources and also support when they need it. Organizational support is important because it shows organizations and leaders care for volunteer well-being and safety. And this, of course, makes sure that volunteers have positive volunteering experience and participation. It also generates a sense of safety, make them more committed, engaged. To practice enhancing organizational support, leaders should pay attention to volunteer overall satisfaction and well-being. Or when you make decisions, it's important to take into account volunteers' perspective and opinions. The seventh practice is giving recognition. So it's important for leaders that they positively and regularly acknowledge volunteer their work, the impact of their work, their contribution to the organization. Volunteer work without financial compensation, but research evidence that non-monetary rewards and recognition can boost their satisfaction and commitment. So giving recognition infuses volunteers a sense of accomplishment, making them more satisfied and committed with their work. So again, leaders might regularly recognize and praise volunteers for the impact of their work, their contribution, their performance. But it's not just at individual achievement, it's also important that leaders acknowledge the good work done by a team. So the last practice, this is ensuring equity. So this practice is about creating an organizational environment that treats every volunteer with balance, respect, and justice. Because when volunteers feel that they are treated unfairly or they have a sense of inequity, they become dissatisfied, upset, and quit volunteering. An ethical climate with sincere and authentic leaders also help build credibility, which make volunteers want to continue to volunteering, motivate them to stay with the organization. So leaders should ensure that all the protocols, processes, or decisions in the organization are applied consistently without bias, and also treat volunteers with dignity and respect. So these are the 8 practices, and again, you can have a look at it again with some of the suggested action from the handout here. However, we want to emphasize again that these are from the research perspective. It may or may not align with your effective leadership practice that you have shared before, your experience. And also, we acknowledge that even though that we have right leadership in place, but we have different contexts and we work with different people. So there are something like internal driver that motivate people to volunteer, and at this point, leadership and leaders' behavior play a key role into triggering, fulfilling that motivation so that volunteer engage in volunteering or not. So I would hand it back over to Toby. She will explain you more with a closer look related to leadership and volunteer motivation. Thank you.
Right, so Tram just sort of ended on the point that the practices that have been distilled from research, hopefully you see some alignment with things that you are doing in your context. Maybe not all apply, maybe they're sort of phrased slightly differently to what you see on the ground, and that is sort of to be expected because context is everything. And to really drive home that point, what I want to do now is share with you some of the research insights we've gleaned by taking a much closer look at a very specific volunteering context, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the emergency response volunteering context within regional Australia. So another colleague of ours from the Volunteer Leadership Research Group back at UTAS couldn't be here with us today, Dr. Amber Tsai. She completed her PhD through our research group, and she really focused on emergency response volunteers, what motivates them to volunteer, and then what do their motivations to volunteer tell us about the kind of leadership they need and want in order to keep volunteering. Now, emergency response volunteers are, at least, I don't know if you use this term in the real world, but in research, they're considered high stakes. And they're considered high stakes because, well, the work they do is high stakes, but also because it takes a lot of training to get them response ready. So there's a long lead time and a lot of upkeep to have a response ready brigade of fire or ambulance or SES group, right? So they're high stakes because they take a lot of training and we want to keep them for as long as we can. So sort of that context that Amber focused her research on, and what she looked at was how we can determine the motivations people have for volunteering. And for this piece of the research we used, it's probably the most commonly used tool to assess motivations to volunteer. It's called the Volunteer Functions Inventory. It's not the only one, but it is very commonly used. So we use this tool, and the Volunteer Functions Inventory identifies 6 different functions that volunteering can serve people. So each one is sort of a motivation to volunteer, where people motivated for the values function are volunteering because it allows them an opportunity to express their personal beliefs and values through an organization with which they're aligned. The understanding function has to do with volunteering. It's those people that volunteer because volunteering offers them an opportunity to learn new knowledge or skills. The career function, we heard sort of a mention of this earlier. That's when people volunteer because it's going to help them progress in their careers, which is fine, but that's a distinct motivation to volunteer. The social function is about volunteering because it will offer us a chance for social connection. And the enhancement function is a motivation to volunteer because it will be an opportunity for us to enhance our self-esteem or sort of grow and develop psychologically. The 6th function is this protective function, which is when we volunteer because it helps us reduce or negate sort of negative feelings or negative experiences. So people volunteer for all of these reasons, and people typically have a primary reason for volunteering. So one of these things will be the primary reason they start to volunteer. What we did with Amber's research is we took the volunteer functions inventory and we rolled it out with emergency response volunteers across regional Australia, and then we used these motivations to volunteer to sort of segment emergency response volunteers so we could say, okay, well, those that are volunteering primarily for a values function, this is the kind of leadership they need and want in order to keep volunteering. And it was a very fancy survey that Amber designed, and it measured all these things and, proved them statistically and whatnot. And same for each of these functions. So people motivated for the understanding function, what kind of leadership do they need and want in order to keep volunteering? So I'm not going to go through all of the research, each of the functions, because it's long and it's published and I can share it. Again, grab me after, or contact details will be on the last slide, or you can just Google it and it'll come up. But what I do want to do is share a couple of the insights we gleaned, because they were Well, they really help drive home the importance of context, because this was, again, a very specific subsector of volunteering, and it was regional. Perhaps it would be different in urban, don't know. But it really does help us understand the importance of sort of a granular look at who it is we're dealing with when we are attempting to lead with and lead our volunteers. So the first one was those volunteers motivated, again, emergency response in regional Australia, those emergency response volunteers motivated by the enhancement function. So that is, they are volunteering because it offers them an opportunity to increase their self-esteem and grow psychologically. Well, they prefer relational leadership practices, which that aligns with practice 1 that Tram just outlined. And we kind of expect that. We really tend to focus on relationship-focused leadership. That's great. I advocate for that all the time. So one of these volunteers shared that she being this volunteer's leader, she is always supportive and has kind words for everyone. So really focused on the relational nature, being kind, being inclusive, and fostering those meaningful relationships. When we looked at those volunteers motivated for the opportunity to have that sort of values alignment, so motivated by the values function, well, they preferred a slightly different form of leadership. They prefer leadership focused more on personal development. So emergency response volunteers that are there because of the values alignment, they tend to want leaders who are a little bit more focused on aligning opportunities for volunteers to enhance their learning and growth. And another quote from one of these volunteers is, "My leader facilitated discussions on where we wanted to go as a brigade." So that's an opportunity to align personal values with the organizational values. And then he asked us what we wanted to do and was willing to get us there. So that's really investing in this personal development of the individual volunteer in their group. Okay, so values function, if we're motivated by values, the kind of leadership emergency response volunteers tend to prefer is this focus on personal development. Now, the one that surprised us, and this is the last one that I'll share with you, was this. And emergency response volunteers who are motivated by the understanding function, so they are volunteering because they see it as an opportunity to gain new knowledge and skills. Now, there weren't demographic correlations with the other motivational profiles. There were for this one, and these volunteers also tended to be younger. So they tended to be younger, they're motivating because it's an opportunity to enhance their understanding, and they want task-related leadership, which is surprising because we never go out there and train leaders how to be more task-focused. We go out there and we talk about the importance of relationships and recognition and building shared purpose, and we do hypothesize that these volunteers probably have decent relationships. They're probably not volunteering in super toxic, destructive, abusive types of situations, but they want task-focused. So less of the nice personal development, more of the planning, monitoring, training. Okay, and that is somewhat surprising when we think about the general advice and consensus on what we need to do to lead our volunteers. So what this means for you is that it is very important, and I know you know your volunteers, but it is vitally important that we contextualize our leadership knowledge and our leadership practices, and there is a ton of very general leadership stuff out there. And Tram sort of alluded to that. A lot of the stylistic theories that are out there in the leadership industry, they're okay, but they are not contextualized to a volunteering context, and they're not contextualized to your context. And so what this means for you, we suggest, is that as Tram indicated in your conference bags, you have handouts, you have a copy of the 8 practices that have been distilled from all of the studies on leading volunteers. You have a copy of those 6 functions, those 6 reasons people are motivated to volunteer, and you have just a very simple sort of action plan. And we won't spend time doing it now because we're trying to cinch it in time-wise. But we do encourage you to pull that out when you get back to normal life or your workplace or your volunteering place and have a think about it, because it's vitally important. And you can, if you can afford the time and resources to do a comprehensive piece of research and actually empirically determine for pretty much sure what exactly is motivating your volunteers and what exactly they want in terms of leadership, that's fantastic. Many of us cannot afford the time and resources involved in that, but you can use your powers of discernment, you can use your knowledge of your volunteers, you can use the resources we've shared with you, and you can just make some educated guesses. I think my volunteers are showing up for these reasons. This, I think, is what motivates them. So then which of these practices might best help me trigger their motivations, help keep them satisfied, engaged, and likely to keep showing up so we can keep pursuing and delivering the vital services that we do. I will leave it there. I'm sorry, we were going to give you action planning time and do a bit of a workshop, but we're saving time. Yes? 5 minutes shaved, but that was your time, so I apologize. This is the action plan. You have these handouts in your conference packs, and then this one, happy, if you want to be in touch, if you like reading research, happy to send you research or industry reports, or if you want to talk research, we could talk research all day. Grab us after, be in touch. Thank you so much. Keep doing the amazing work you do. Thank you.